that is now going live. Let me just double check that it has connected. Amazing. Thank you for your patience with that. Right, so now I'm very excited to hand over to our panel on ethics, and they'll be discussing practical implementations of ethics in research software. We have an incredible lineup of panelists today. Laura Cardle will chair the session, where we also have Garnet, Ariel, Steph, and Andrew, and they will all be introducing themselves very shortly. If they do have a set of pre-prepared questions that they will be discussing, but you can submit questions to them via Slido. It's the same event code as yesterday, and it's linked. I'll share a link to that in the chat in just a moment. And you just click on the panel on ethics room in there. And if they have time, they can address them in the notes after the panel. And with that, I will hand over to Laura.
Thank you, Rachel. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, great. Hi, everybody. My name's Laura Carter. I'm one of the steering committee members for this year's collaboration workshop. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Essex, where I research the human rights impact of public sector technology, particularly on gender discrimination and stereotyping in the UK. I'm delighted to be chairing today's panel, which is going to be on the practical implications of ethics in research and in software. Dr. Pamela Agrodike's keynote yesterday asked us to think about some of the ethical challenges that can arise from software development and about the real world impact on individuals that software can have. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Garnet Cheng, Ariel Bennett, Steph Garasto, and Andrew Strait as our panelists today to talk about some of the practical work that they have done in their various roles to design software and carry out research in an ethical way. And I'm going to pass now to each of the panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Garnet.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here. I am calling in from Kigali, Rwanda. My name is Garnet Cheng, and I am a data and digital rights researcher at Policy, which is a feminist civic technology collective based in Uganda. Yes, and I'm excited to be here to contribute my thoughts and learnings on ethics in research and software.
Welcome, Garnet. Good to hand over to Ariel to introduce yourself now.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ariel Bennett. I am the program manager for the Tools, Practices and Systems program at the Alan Turing Institute. I'm also a core contributor to the Turing Way project. And for my sins, I am an ordinary committee member for United Tech and Allied Workers, which is a branch of the Communication Workers Union, and one of the unions that are currently trying to organise tech workers in the UK. I'm really looking forward to discussing today the impact that 360-degree ethics and its approaches can have on your work and the work that we do together to improve research culture from a software perspective.
Thank you, Ariel. Welcome. I'll pass now to Steph.
Hi, everyone. I'm Steph. I'm a lecturer in data science at the University of Greenwich, and I'm also a volunteer at a non-profit organization called DataKind UK, whose goal is to advance the use of responsible data science in the non-profit sector. So I'll be wearing a bit of two hats today, but I do guess bring the same perspective, me being me, to both of them. Yeah, excited to be here and have a chat about ethics.
Thank you, Steph. And last but not least, I'll ask Andrew to introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. I'm Andrew Strait. I'm the Associate Director of Research Partnerships at the Ada Lovelace Institute. Prior to that, I was at DeepMind's Ethics and Society team. And prior to that, I was a content moderator at Google for about 7 years. A lot of our work at Ada focuses on various accountability mechanisms and also questions around research culture and research ethics. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk about some of our research and some of our experiences.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to start by asking each of the panelists in turn to talk about some examples of how you implement ethics in the work that you do, and particularly what are the benefits of this implementation and how it strengthens your work. And I'll start with Garnet.
Thank you so much for your question. And I think just to give an illustration of how we use ethics in our work, I'm just going to give a quick story of like a situation where ethics were not involved in research, right? So I think in 2020, there was a randomized controlled trial research done by the World Bank in a community in Nairobi, Kenya, where I'm from. And so the study was to understand whether people living in the slum areas and the lower income areas of Nairobi would pay their water bills if landlords for the buildings where this low income populations lived would pay water bills if they were threatened, if the tenants were threatened with threats of disconnection and ultimately if the water was disconnected, right? And so the study looked to understand how better to get people to pay their water bills. And by people here, I mean the landlords who own the buildings. But at the end of the day, 97 households lacked water for like 9 months, right? And so with this study, and these are people in the lower income areas of Nairobi. So without water, we know that in such communities, waterborne diseases are rife because now people have to look for water in other places. And this is not clean water as opposed to what the Nairobi water company would provide, right? And this research was sanctioned by different institutions, including Kenyan research boards. At the end of the day, people lacked water for close to a year. The people who were supposed to pay back, who are the landlords, were not affected by these water cuts because typically they don't live in these houses, right? And once you look at informed consent, like the people who lived in those buildings did not have an awareness of what was going on behind the scenes. They did not know that this was simply an experiment to force their landlords to pay their water bills, their outstanding water bills, right? And so I think this is the greatest example of what could go wrong when we don't think about ethics when it comes to research. And how I think about it, how we as policy would do it in the first place was that such a research should not have been conducted in the first place, right? What is the ethics? I mean, what is the rationale behind denying people already living in deplorable conditions and taking their water away to test whether the owners of the houses they lived in would pay the bills? Like, what is the rationale behind that? And I think one of the first principles of research is that you're not supposed to do any harm. So it always has me thinking, like, were the researchers thinking about the harm that would be caused to the populations? Why wasn't the study directed at the landlords instead? Landlords who were wealthy people who did not live in these houses anyway, right? And the second thing I would think about is contestation, right? When you're conducting research with populations, especially vulnerable and marginalized populations, they rarely have the agency to push back, right? And in this case, the researchers talked about they also wanted to see whether the tenants would complain to the landlords to make them pay. So they were trying to see like the agency in the situation, but they're forgetting that these are people who are lower income, they're already marginalized in society, and they barely have any bargaining power over their landlords, right? And so when we're thinking about research, especially when it comes to stuff like technology, where the population may not be able to understand what's going on, I think we see that in situations where AI is deployed on populations and people don't even understand how the systems work in the first place. So how can they contest something they do not know, right? And I think the last thing we think about is fairness. Was this research fair? No, because the risks were only distributed to the people at the end of the chain, right? And as we're thinking about research, and if we're going to have any risks, are they distributed equally across people, or are they just distributed the most marginalized people in the kind of societies that we're researching on, right? And I think one of the things I thought about as somebody who's lived in Kenya is that once your water is disconnected, you still have to pay a fee for it to be connected again. And so just all these difficulties that come with somebody trying to understand whether a landlord would pay back, right? Just thinking about all these dynamics. And so at Policy and myself as a researcher, we come into research from a decolonial and feminist perspective. So we like to think about decolonial values like fairness, safety, diversity, and feminist values like reflexivity and positionality. So to shape the way we look at research and research on populations. And we use these two lenses because they help us understand the power imbalance involved in our studies and also understand the distribution of the impacts of our study. Yeah.
Thank you, Garnet. I think the Nairobi water study is such an awful cautionary tale about some of the things that can go wrong when you don't think about different stakeholders and the power involved in research. So I think that's such a useful illustration. Thank you. I'm going to ask the same question to Steph about some examples of how you implement ethics in the work that you do and how it strengthens your work.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I'm going to be talking about this question from a DataKind volunteer perspective. So just wanted to highlight a bit of what we try to do within the organization that as many things is by no means perfect, and we try to improve it every day. And the first thing I would mention is that I agree in the sense of one of the first questions should be, at least in my opinion, should this project take place in the first place? Should we do it or should we not do it? And that's something that we grappled with, and we haven't. We try not to shy away from saying no to projects and to ideas that we don't feel either that they can be done in principle in an ethical way. So I think there were some examples of microloans, projects using predictive models that also were coupled with for-profit companies. So it was just a project we didn't feel suitable for us to do. And also, like, in terms of working with text, it's been taking us a long time before we even started looking at how to project that heavily involve text with and language model with all the massive ethical implications that are still going on to these days. The way we're trying to embed this and make sure that all these considerations are spotted early and continuously throughout the process is to try and encourage not only the ethics committee that existed at the time, but also every single one of our volunteers to spot potential ethical issues, to be able to raise them, to not shy away from any of these conversations that are needed, and also to encourage them to think about solutions, but not immediate solutions. Like, we're very aware that ethics is not fixed in, oh, we've thought about it, that's fine. Oh, we've added this one line of code, it's fine. That's not the case, and we try to have a working model where time is allocated and resources are allocated to be able to move on and address things better. One example was we had a case some time ago about a food bank non-profit that wanted to create a predictive model to predict dependency from on their service, which, and there were lots of discussion with the chart itself, like, okay, how do we make sure that this doesn't involve then refusing food to people? How do we make sure that, like, this doesn't just turn into a into something that into decision-making system that doesn't have any I'm going to use another use word, sorry, human in the loop. And again, I think what worked well in that case was that we were exactly able to spot all these problems early because we all of our volunteers were aware of them and brought them up at a time when we could address them, right? And at the end of the project, where then it would have been less useful.
Great. Oh, sorry, Steph, carry on.
No, I'm done. Sorry.
No. Yeah, I think that's great. It's such a good point that ethics isn't a one and done system, that it's something that needs to be considered throughout the process of research and implementing a project. I think is such an important point. And also to your first point, that sometimes the right course of action is not to do the research at all. I'm going to pass now to Ariel to talk about some of the ways that you implement ethics in the work that you do and what the benefits of that are.
Yeah, so I think I would definitely echo Steph's point that ethics is not a box to be ticked and just a simple form to be filled out. We really do try and consider it to be a continuous process of reflection and consideration throughout projects that we work on at the Tools, Practices and Systems program. Particularly those that where we're working in concert with groups that might be marginalized or be sort of traditionally people who research is done to rather than done with. There's always, something new to consider and reflect on, and then change course depending on the information and the discussion that we have with those folks. I think the other point I would like to make as well on this is embedding ethics is a 360-degree process as well. So it's not only continuous, but you should be thinking about the impact of your work on the people who are participating in the research and potentially being impacted by the research outputs. But you should also think about the people who are doing that research and the conditions in which they're doing that research. And they're also not passive participants, they're active participants in the work. So they should also be considering, the ethics of the work that they're doing and the conditions in which they're working as well, and sort of having this conversation and this dialogue. So I wouldn't say that anybody in the process should be passive and kind of just having things put on them. Everybody can take an active part in this. Specifically at the Turing, and in TPS, we're very aware of the volunteer work that supports our projects. We do find ways to actively acknowledge and credit contributors to make sure that they're benefiting and receiving, credit for the work that they put into some of our projects. For example, the Turing Way has over 300 contributors, but when you have people who are invited to give talks on the Turing Way, the co-leads are very keen to make sure that it's not just the two project co-leads that are presenting and representing the project, but actually the people who are contributing to the project as well, getting that recognition for the work that they've put in. And one other aspect I also wanted to highlight, particularly relevant for research software engineers, is that we build contribution to open source projects in as part of role descriptions for folks who are part of the program. So they're actively expected to be spending some time contributing to open source projects because of the aims and the values of the program itself. I know this is a bit of a thorny issue for open source, how to manage volunteer contributions and fair, recompense for people's labor on projects, but that's one of the ways that we're tackling that at the program.
Thanks, Ariel. Yes, extremely good points around recognizing different contributions and also recognizing the volunteer and paid labor that goes into a lot of work. I think this is a really important and often under-referenced point to do with working ethically in software and in research. And I'm going to pass now to Andrew to talk about some of the ways that you implement ethics in the work that you do and how it strengthens your work.
Yeah, well, I mean, just massive agreement with everyone before. I mean, the notion that ethics isn't a tick box exercise and a continuous process of reflection is a key one that I think we hold true in our work. I'm really struck always by something that Shannon Ballard from Edinburgh once said to me, which I think is a really, really good way of framing ethics. That it's a set of lenses that allow you to look at a problem and it's meant to encourage a reflexive engagement with those questions. And it's meant to be a continuous engagement. It's meant to follow all through the different stages of the life cycle of an AI system or a data-driven system, from the early ideation phase to your data collection, to your sort of research methodology, all the way through to the point when you're kind of thinking about, you know, are you going to turn this into a product, or are you going to license this to somebody? Are you going to make this available publicly via an open source platform? And those are all kinds of things that I think are critical for us to think about. And when we talk about the sort of moment that we're in right now, it feels like a lot of the questions that we're grappling with as developers and as researchers are focused on creating a culture of more engagement and reflexive consideration of those potential issues and impacts. And I think a lot of that is about the kind of broader societal impact of what you're trying to do. You know, I think research ethics is this term that's very unhelpful, right? It's often talking about just the methodology of your research, when you know, RRI or broader societal impact questions are kind of more of the thing that come up when we think about some of the most egregious examples of ethical issues arising. And it's incredibly important as researchers and developers, we think about that, right? Like, it's terrible for our field, for your own career, for your own sort of benefit, let alone for the people you're affecting if your research causes harm. And so that's why I think engaging with these kinds of practical reflexive exercises is so important as an entire academic sort of field of study, let alone as an individual. And some of the ways we've done that in practice, I'll pull one example that we've used from my time in industry, was really around trying to focus on reflexive documentation exercises. Those exercises like model cards or data sheets, where you're trying to actively write out and document who your stakeholders are, what you think the potential impacts of this work will be, how you've tested it for bias, or what intended uses you envision happening. The piece that we never got to, and this is where I think there's more to be done, is how do you not only identify your stakeholders, but engage with them? You don't want a situation in which you're just in a sort of ivory tower, just thinking up potential issues and impacts. You want to really co-create those with affected communities. And to take another example of some work we've done at Ada Lovelace Institute, we've just finished a project with the NHS that's trying to get at this exact kind of issue. It involves an algorithmic impact assessment exercise that part of it involves engaging with a panel of patients, clinicians, and others who will be affected by the medical AI services that would be developed. And you literally can't get data access if you don't engage with this panel. You're co-creating the impacts with them. It's a model that we think works in this very specific, bespoke sort of context, but we'd love to see other researchers and teams engage with that kind of exercise, you know, really pushing the limits on that kind of stakeholder engagement and creating better products. And just in terms of the benefits it adds, I mean, it is enormous benefits. It makes your products better, safer. It helps you identify also just like what are the ways in which, if this is going to be integrated well, what are the requirements for it to be integrated well? What needs to happen for that to occur? That all gets to, I think, the big goal that we're trying to achieve, which is we want our research to be of social benefit. We want it to be used in the world. And for that to happen, it does involve close engagement with affected communities. Yeah, I'll end there, but very excited to be talking more about this.
Thanks, Andrew. Yes, and I think to pick up on many excellent points there, but I think particularly around the benefits of engaging ethically, and the fact that there really is no benefit to not, you know, there's actual harm to not doing ethical research and building software ethically. And to pick up on your point about engaging with stakeholders, I'm going to move now to the next question around thinking about the different people who are involved in research, and particularly research where we're building software to support that research. I think it's really important, and I'm going to ask each panelist to speak now about who the different stakeholders are and how they should be engaged, and particularly what are the power dynamics that can come into play that we need to be aware of. I think this has been touched on before, but I'd like to give the panelists some time to talk more about this. So I'm going to start with Ariel.
Yeah, so picking up on the thread of what I said previously about, you know, it not just being sort of the research subjects, but also the people who are participating in research that should be taking ethical considerations into account. And I want to really emphasize the point that it shouldn't be just the PI of a project who is thinking about ethics. It should be everybody involved in a project. And people, particularly say research software engineers, who a lot of people on this call are, you know, sometimes it can feel as though they're being brought into a project where things have already been decided, maybe the ethics form has already been submitted, and they maybe don't feel as empowered to speak up and have a say on, you know, the ethical implications or problems that they see with the projects. But they should, and because it's really important that everybody participates in this process. And so this is where I kind of want to highlight that it's really powerful to feel as though you have a community or a collective group that will back you if you want to raise issues or say speak out on ethical concerns on projects that you become aware of. I speak to a lot of folks who have kind of taken on the challenge of changing the system on their own. I was speaking on a panel on research infrastructure roles, and a really common refrain was, oh, I tried to change academia and it was very, very hard. So I moved out of it and made a deliberate decision not to. I think one of my responses to that is that it's almost impossible to change the system on your own as an individual, and it shouldn't be an individual's responsibility to try and change the entire system, but it is the responsibility of everybody to change the system. And that's where the importance of collective action comes in, because you can often feel very powerless as one person to raise an issue on a project, say if you've become aware of ethical concerns, or, you know, terrible working conditions, or unsustainable workloads. But that's where collective action, unions, and organized resistance to the system is what achieves changes within the system as well. So there are growing numbers of workers at tech companies. A few come to mind, such as such as the folks who are organising the Deliveroo riders and the courier drivers that are being unfairly targeted by apps that are created. There are a lot of people at the large tech companies, so Google, Facebook, Apple, that are organising against not only policy decisions, but also for better labour conditions, pay, sick leave, etc. And so this is where we're starting to see a real sea change. People are not sort of thinking that tech is this one uniformly brilliant force for good, or two sort of an isolated system that they kind of where people just show up and work on problems, and then whatever happens to them is whatever happens to the work that they do is somebody else's problem later on to figure out the ethics. People are taking that taking on board the idea that you know, ethics is something that everybody should be involved in and should be thinking about, and are organizing collectively to influence the decisions and the policies of companies. And I do also want to highlight here as well about the recent UCU strikes. So this is the University and Colleges Union that some of you on this call will be familiar with. It's the main higher education union in the UK. They are still in the middle of a huge round of strikes that have been ongoing essentially since 2018 around pay, pensions, and working conditions as well. So these are people who are actively out on picket lines at the moment, who are recognizing that the work that they do is unsustainable, that the expectations are unsustainable. They want to challenge the way that their organizations are run, the policy decisions they make, particularly around things like working from home, safety in the classroom as well, with the ongoing pandemic. And they're out there actively fighting for those changes as well. And we have seen some incredible victories. I really want to highlight that after incredible sustained action up in Liverpool, I think it was over 300 job cuts were avoided by collective action, and they retained, I think they wound up only losing 2 members of staff after sustained collective action. So this kind of collective action, the walkouts, the labour organising, so the Amazon on Staten Island have recently voted to form a labour union as well, which is an amazing victory. This type of work is, you know, an integral part of ethics and should be things that people are thinking about when they're sort of doing their work. But I really think that, yeah, sorry, just to kind of sum up here, and so you can move on, that sometimes it can feel as though you're the only voice in the room, or you're the only one who's thinking about ethics. And I think we do need to change that. We need to change that perspective, and help people link up and fight back as part of a group, or to feel confident raising issues as part of a group, and to ensure that those issues do get raised and the policies do change, and we do see some systemic change around the considerations that are taken into account with research.
Thank you, Ariel. I think, yes, very good point, particularly around the value of collective action. That it's often that, yes, it's incredibly difficult to change any system on your own, but as even a small group of people working together can be incredibly powerful. And so there's real value in collective action, particularly in challenging some of the really unhealthy power dynamics that lead to ethical problems. I'm going to ask Garnet now to come in here, because I know policy has done a lot of work around, I think a lot about power and about feminist ways of working, and particularly around the impact of extractive research in global South countries. So I'd love it, Garnet, if you could come in and talk about some of that work.
Yes. Sorry, what's the question again?
So I'm asking around, sorry, I should have restated the original question. So talking now about some of the power dynamics that can come into play when we're talking about research, and one that I'm anxious to bring in here, because we have a fairly global north-focused audience at CW, that I think it's really important to talk about some of the international dimensions, and particularly some of the post-colonial dimensions of research, particularly in software where we use a lot of tech tools that span national borders. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Right. Immediately, when I think of power dynamics in the kind of research that we do, so a lot of our research policy in East Africa and even other African countries is with vulnerable and marginalized communities, right? And so when we're doing research, for instance, with LGBTQI people, we have found that I think I remember thinking about this the other day. In one of the countries we're researching, I'm not sure if it's Uganda, I think it's Uganda, right? With the ethics board process, you have to list some of the participants that are going to take part in the study, right? But then when you're working with LGBTQI people in a country like Uganda, that already puts them at risk. So I think for us, just understanding the power dynamics when it comes to such research is also just realizing that the ethical implications for this research is that people could lose their lives in some of the countries that we work in, right? And so just figuring out workarounds around such ethics board procedures, working to ensure that our respondents are like their data is stored very privately. We make sure we anonymize their data. We don't take pictures, because sometimes it's standard, like when you're going to field, like for field work, you want to take pictures to show back to the team. We don't take pictures of such research because already you're putting people at risk. And I think another thing when it comes to working with such communities is that as a researcher, you're probably coming from a place where, for instance, I'm a straight researcher, right? I really can't go into a queer community for such research. We prefer to have somebody from the community do the research instead, right? So then your respondents feel safer and they're able to share. And it's in a place where they feel comfortable sharing with a person that they're familiar with, right? So just understanding such dynamics. I think another important one I realize every day is when you're working on digital inequality and you're trying to understand how people feel about such things, right? And I remember with COVID last year, we couldn't go meet people in person. So we had to turn to Zoom research. And we found that people wouldn't show up to sessions that they had signed up for because of data. Zoom is a very data consuming platform, right? So, and just thinking about how do we make sure that our participants are facilitated, right? I think this is something we don't take lightly, especially in an African context where people want to participate, but they can't afford it for the most part. So how do you make sure people feel valued? People feel like their contribution is valued and their time is valued. We practice feminist research where people are experts over their own lives, and experts get paid for their time, right? Whether it's a student in university taking part in your research, they're all experts over their own lives. That's why you're asking them for this information. That's why you're asking them to take part in your study. And part of the way, one of the ways we make them feel valued is compensating them. Could be data refunds, transport refunds if we had them come to a specific venue. Even thinking about things like lunch, right? You don't think about that, but then you have people coming to take part in your study because they're really interested, but they probably didn't even have breakfast when they were coming. So just thinking about such things, right? And I think having this thinking about this power dynamics gives you better participation and better engagement. Like if people know that they're going to be valued, like just looking at the history of research on the continent, I don't think people think about respondents in such a way. Like they're just participants, like we're just going to field to collect data. And nobody thinks about how much it took for these people to come to the community center to give their answers, right? And we're trying to shift that. And it enhances participation. We find that people are more willing to participate when they feel valued. And I think that's a small way we're looking at changing how people think about power dynamics.
Thank you, Garnet. I think that's such a good point, that recognizing that when you're asking people to participate, you are asking them as experts, and expertise should be valued, is such an important one, but it quite often gets lost, particularly when we're doing research, when people from the global north are doing research in the global south. So I think it's such an important point. I'm going to ask Steph now to comment on some of the power dynamics that can come into play in the work that you do, and how you manage that.
Thank you. First of all, I'd say yeah, amazingly great points that were just being made. I totally agree. Like asking the questions and trying to really be mindful about, okay, where is the money going? It's very important. And also, how can we make sure that we can, like especially in academia, how can we make sure that we can, and we are actively trying to redirect resources that as academics, we might be in a more privileged position to access. How can we redirect them to other communities? And it's a question I'm starting to grapple with at the moment. And it doesn't have an easy answer, and it highly depends on the funder. Unfortunately, like there are many different funding models out there, and some are more or less appropriate to pay people properly. And that's, yeah, and I find, and this space, I find it like fascinating, and definitely still without a good answer on how exactly to do it. But I do think it's a very important one. In my volunteer work, as the word implies, it's a different dynamic, because like the kind of UK does rely a lot on volunteers, which usually do come from a more potentially privileged space of being able to volunteer in the first place. So how to handle those power dynamics, then it changes, because it's not it's being trying really hard to like not overwork them, or like to make sure that everyone can benefit. But then you do want to make sure that everyone can benefit, and that the situations is not skewed one way or another. And yeah, there are lots of thoughts on there on like how to make that happen. And I do think that, again, resources is a great, like making sure that the money is there and goes to good use is important. Like, okay, fine, we're not paying volunteers, but maybe we could have, or like there could be an idea of like two parallel streams, like a volunteer or a paid internship, for example. Or also, yeah, and the second thing is, yeah, dialogue. Like it's making sure that all parties are involved with each other, so that there is this there is communication ongoing, and it balances a bit more in terms of benefits.
Really good point, Steph. Thank you. I think particularly about thinking about where funding is coming from and where it's going, and maintaining communication with people who are involved in the research that you're doing is super, super important. And I'm going to pass now to Andrew to talk about some of the power dynamics that you've encountered in your work and how you manage those relationships and how you address power.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts come to mind. One that Ariel already touched on, which I think is a really important one, particularly with AI and machine learning research, is just the incredible importance of data enrichment workers, who are literally the reason why we're able to do this work in the first place. Like they are an essential and oftentimes completely unrewarded component of this research. And in thinking about how to reward them, the first thought is obviously compensation, which I think, that is not even a standard within the industry, but it's something that needs to be more thoroughly discussed. There need to be more institutional policies that dictate like what are the right practices, and particularly the ways in which, unfortunately, I've seen some researchers like abuse sort of systems like MTurk to get free labor out of a contract by sort of canceling the contract after the work's been done. But the other part of that as well is thinking beyond compensation. What is it that those workers want? How can you provide some form of reciprocity to meet their needs? It's not necessarily going to be just in attributing them by name in a paper. That might not mean anything to them, but it's important to ask that question. And to engage with those communities. You don't need to necessarily find every single MTurk worker that you've ever worked with and ask, but there are communities on Reddit, the MTurk work that Lily Ronnie is running, which all are aimed at trying to provide a source of guidance and voice of contact for what are the kinds of actions you as a researcher can take to better support that data enrichment workers. And then the other thing that comes to mind is the variety of sort of non-obvious stakeholders for the kind of work that I think often comes up in AI and machine learning research that we don't think about, but that are, have a very significant impact on its success and its use. I often use this one example of someone who was sort of thinking, developing a tool that was meant to be integrated into a hospital, which would have sort of essentially helps doctors diagnose patients from a tablet in their hand. And they talked with sort of healthcare professionals in the abstract. They talked with sort of some patients even about how exciting this would be. The one group they didn't talk to is nurses. And nurses are the most important group, if you think about it, because they're the ones who are actually providing and using the software. And the thing completely failed. It led to the complete loss of this company's product, and all their contracts were canceled because it just didn't fit well with the way that nurses worked. So, I think that those kinds of stakeholder evaluations, considering like who is using your technology and what are the power dynamics that exist between different users of your system, is really key. In that case, that was a situation in which the way that nurses were, this system was sort of changing the dynamic of how doctors trusted the judgment of nurses, led to nurses not trusting it, and that broke the whole thing. It's one of those ways in which you need to be very careful and very reflexive about the ways in which these very complex socio-technical dynamics that we're trying to operate if you're going to have a successful product. So yeah, I just want to say massive support to all the other comments that the other panelists have said, and just to really reemphasize the importance of doing that kind of stakeholder mapping and deep reflexive consideration and study of what it is you're trying to accomplish and what kinds of environment you're trying to roll your technology into.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, really good points around just making sure you get the right stakeholders involved, and particularly important to think about the crowd workers who are completely essential for a lot of data work and yet are often completely invisible and don't get recognized in the work that we do. We've got 2 minutes left on the panel, so thank you all so much. I'm going to ask you very quickly to briefly say what specific resources or techniques would you point the attendees today to help them continue to use ethical lenses and use ethical development in their work. I'm going to start with Garnet.
So sorry, what was the question again? So sorry.
Specific examples of resources that you point attendees to help them with ethics in their work.
Right. So I think the way we think about this, I don't think I'm going to point people out to a specific resource, but to Feminist Values. and also just values espoused by decolonial theory. So I think when you take a feminist approach to research, there are just some values already embedded in it. You have intersectionality, like how do you meet people where they're at? How do you understand how their different experiences could shape how they participate in research or the kind of responses that they give you, right? You have accountability. How are you held accountable for the way you're conducting research? And I think that's something that's really enshrined in feminist research methods. Contestation. Do the people you're researching have the autonomy and agency to resist the kind of methods you're using? Like, what if they feel that like some questions are invasive? How can they go against that, right? And how are you as a researcher going to be held accountable if you don't do the right thing? How are you going to, like, transparency, how are you going to share how you conducted the research and make it available to everyone? And I think another feminist value in research is that it's not just for knowledge production, but it's also for positive social change. The goal of feminist research is not always just produce data and produce knowledge, but also to impact people positively. And I think that's the most important one, right? Like, what are the outcomes of this research? Does it cause harm to people? Like, how can we improve the lives of the people we're researching, or the lives of the people who are doing this research with us? Like, yeah. And then with decolonial, just decolonial theory, how is the research fair? Like, are the risks of research, the research we're studying, are they distributed fairly, or are they just being piled on the marginalized communities, right? Safety, diversity, resistance. How can our respondents resist us as researchers? And I think these are just some of the values we think about when we're doing.
That's great. Thank you so much, Garnet. We've gone a little bit over time, so I'm going to put more resources in the Slack channel, and I'm going to invite the other panelists to do that as well. But I think to end on the point that Garnet made, that positive social change is something that we're all working towards in the research that we're doing, in the software that we're building. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Garnet, Steph, Ariel, and Andrew for participating today. And thank you to Rachel for organising. And I'll hand back to Rachel now as the organiser. Thank you so much.